Much indeed for joining us this evening. We're very honoured to have Professor Bryan Pilkington speak with us tonight, and he will be speaking on the always topical subject of conscientious objection and understanding conscientious objection. Bryan Pilkington is Professor of Bioethics at the Department of Medical Sciences at the Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine, where he is the ethics content lead, and his recent publications include The Medical Act, Conscientious Practice in a World of Dissension and Disagreement, Springer Nature 2025. So without further ado, Professor Pilkington.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks to Helen originally for reaching out, and to Ilaria for all the assistance. And again, apologies for being a little tardy. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just very excited for this conversation. As you can imagine, I'm really interested in questions surrounding conscientious objection. And so hopefully this will be fun. Can you all see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful, wonderful. Excellent. And please feel free. I'm aiming for around 45-ish minutes, but yell at any point if I should stop or you want to fight about something. So what I'd like to do is I'll say a little bit about myself for a moment, talk about why I'm interested in conscientious objection, what sort of got the book launched, and then go through some basics and then some more controversial arguments in the book. So as was kindly mentioned, I teach ethics at the Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine in Nutley, New Jersey. I direct a small lab, a health ethics lab, and host a podcast, which connects up to public philosophy and public ethics conversations that I'm very interested in. You might also notice some nods to questions around professions and what constitutes professions and professionalism. I've recently become interested, in addition to ethics content, in what professions are. And so I'm the editor-in-chief of a small publication in that space. And thanks so much for mentioning the book. This is the first book I've written, and it's very nice to talk about the content of it. When you do, the publisher, I mean, you'll probably know you've written a bunch of books, the publisher tells you what a great achievement this is. So you feel really good. And then they give you a coupon and try to get you to sell the book. So it's been a back and forth and interesting experience. So I'll say a little bit about why I'm interested in conscience and questions of conscience. I'll say what I think other folks mean by conscientious objection. It's not my favorite term. I talk about conscientious practice. We can do some terminology stuff and then get into the arguments. And then I want to offer a few ideas which are in the book. And sort of some of it's basic. I'll be tracking some of the histories around conversations about conscientious objection, a little bit of work on disagreement. And I take it that the most controversial claim in the book is that conscience and religion don't have anything to do with each other, or conscientious objection. And so we can spend some time on that. Hopefully people have some nice critiques. My positive move is really what we're talking about is more responsibility. That's where the rub is. And then I'll say something about what it is to act within medicine. And I don't think you're allowed to give talks without mentioning AI. So hopefully we'll wrap up before that. But if folks are really interested in AI, we can connect AI to conscience. So why conscience? Well, three stories, which I hope, sort of narrative bits, which I hope will be helpful in giving background to why I'm very interested in this subject. And the first actually starts in a non-medical context. So my background's in philosophy, and when I took my first sort of proper ethics philosophy job after a postdoc, I was assigned to teach a very, very large section of an introductory philosophy course with an ungodly number of students. And I politely requested smaller numbers of students, and I objected and went back and forth with the administration. And it was a formative experience, it turned out, because what I learned was that there are just different conceptions of what folks are doing when they do philosophy. And that started me down the road of thinking about conscience, respect for conscience within professional spheres. And so in response to my claim that there were just too many students in a room to do philosophy, and we can fight if people like about what it means to do philosophy, I thought students had to interact and go back and forth, to offer arguments, to think about responses. And that couldn't be done with the number of students and the time allowed. The response that I received was, don't worry, we have the answer, Brian. We have Scantron tests. Do you have folks familiar with Scantron tests? These are you can write a bunch of multiple choice questions. You feed them into the administration system and it gives you it grades it for you. And I thought, that's just not what it is to do philosophy, to sort of be able to identify whether, A, B, C, or D is correct. And so it led me down this road of thinking whether members of particular groups or professions, I don't think philosophers are members of a profession, but whether we should defer to experts in those spaces. And so that's what really got me thinking about conscience now a number of years ago. The second, I think, formative story, so after I taught in a philosophy department for a bit and then ran some ethics things at different places, I ended up doing a lot of interprofessional practice work with different health professions. So physicians, nurses, techs, athletic trainers, a variety of folks involved in the health sciences. And I got very, very interested, and I'll say a little more about this case later on, in pacemakers and defibrillators ended up with some heart issues later down the road. Usually you sort of do the work after you've had the issue. I did it before. And so there's a case that I'll talk about where a physician was asked to do something that the physician found deeply objectionable. And sort of thinking about that and the disagreement that occurred among professionals sort of also pushed me into thinking more and more about questions of conscience and conscientious objection. And the third story, which sort of helped lead me to this work, was I gave a talk years ago that touched on, sort of very early versions of one of the main themes in this book, which is that religion and conscientious objection are not as closely tied as most folks in the literature seem to argue. And it was a deeply humbling experience. I gave a talk which I thought carved out space for folks with religious commitments to interact in the public sphere. And I was chided fairly strongly in Q&A, and then with some strongly worded follow-up by a religious leader in the town where I gave this talk, who told me, you can't give this kind of talk in this town. This is a religious town. And it was an interesting experience because like I said, I think that the arguments in the book and arguments I'll lay out later on in our conversation carve out space for exactly the kinds of things that persons with deeply held beliefs would find amenable. But again, it was sort of very, very deeply rejected. I wasn't run out of the town, but it was, it was a challenging experience. So it's these experiences that led me to really think about conscience and conscientious objection. I suspect most people are familiar generally with what we would want to call questions of conscience, conscientious objection. We can do some terminology in a bit. And it's still, it's a live issue. And so I appreciated the introduction about how this is sort of always a live issue. Not everyone thinks that it is. And so there's a recent paper in the Journal of Medical Ethics, and I am terrible with slides, so my apologies. There's too many words, there's not enough words. Forgive me, I know the session is being recorded, and I'm happy to share the slides with anyone if you want a magnifying glass to go through it. But in a paper that just came out in JME by Stephen Clark, there's a nice summary which I think encapsulates what lots of folks talking about and thinking about conscientious objection want to say. And it actually harkens back to another sort of very popular paper, at least within my circles, by Ezekiel Emanuel and Ronit Stahl, which came out in 2017 in the New England Journal of Medicine, around sort of considerations between physicians and military folks. And anyway, so this is, I think, what other people mean when they're thinking about conscientious objection, or what's commonly referred to. So conscientious objection is an objection based on either moral or religious grounds. To exercise, and again, this is Clark, to exercise a CO, a healthcare professional must first acquire a prima facie legal or institutional obligation as part of their current work role to perform an act that is inconsistent with their moral or religious views. a healthcare professional who objects on moral or religious grounds to sterilization, I think Clark's just picking an example, but who is not expected to perform a sterilization as part of their job, does not exercise CO to sterilization. But, yep, that sounds right. When a healthcare professional exercises CO, they appeal to an established conscience clause to enable exemption from what would otherwise be a work obligation, and they also implicitly request that they be allowed to retain their current job. I should say, if you haven't run in this paper, Clark wants to make consequentialist arguments and thinks lots of consequentialists just sort of fall into deontological claims when they're doing this work. So that's in the background here. That's not part of my argument. I just think this nicely captures what lots of other people think about when they say conscientious objection. In this way, CO is administered differently in healthcare from the military, the example everyone loves, the other main professional area which ethical controversies about CO arise. In the military, a conscientious objector who objects to killing and who exercises a CO when required to take on a combat role is asking either to be permitted to leave the military or to be moved to a non-combat role. In contrast, an obstetrician who objects to abortion and exercises a CO by appealing to a conscience clause aims to remain in a role which would otherwise oblige them to perform abortions without having to perform abortions. And again, thanks for bearing with me as I read that terribly long quotation. But I think that encapsulates what lots of folks mean when they talk about conscientious objection. A physician, to run with usual examples, though I think this applies to all, there are many, many healthcare professionals. A physician doesn't go in for a certain kind of practice. There's a reasonable expectation the physician would offer that service or engage in that practice. They have some kind of an obligation, and so they ask for some sort of exemption. All right, so that's unstable. Different people mean different things by conscience. I like Dan Solmesi's quick description on this. And so he talks about conscience as having two interrelated parts in a paper now some years ago, a commitment to morality itself, to acting and choosing morally according to one's best ability, and also the activity of judging that an act one has done or about which one is deliberating would violate that commitment. And we can talk, if folks like, I know there's time for Q&A after, about sort of sincerely held beliefs which commonly arise, or what Claire's work around integrity, right? So one of the reasons lots of folks think conscientious objection or some sort of respect for a professional's conscience ought to be maintained is because it's bad to violate the integrity of persons. And if persons have these sincerely held beliefs, and we wouldn't want to put them in situations where they would have to violate those. This seems like a bad thing. And then so we're trying to balance that potential violation with reasonable expectations of patients or persons of the public seeking care, advice, information from recognized health professionals. So I use a term conscientious practice. I don't think I'm the only person who uses this. I don't think I coined it, but it's a term that I found helpful and that is in the title of the book. And so how I frame the debate in the book and in some other places is I think about parties to the debate as either falling into the category of conscientious dissenters or conscience dissenters or conscience protectors. These are poles probably towards which different positions gravitate. There's a cluster of compromised positions. Well, Claire's position is probably a compromised position. Dan Brock is a compromised position. We try to sort of satisfy a variety of parties in this space. So I think about conscience dissenters as those in favor of or who argue for the primacy of professional standards, civil laws, and patient autonomy over the conscientious practice of individual professionals. Again, I teach at a medical school, so I'll say physician a lot. Please correct me. I think this refers to health professionals more broadly, but to those who go for the civil laws relative to particular kinds of treatment, as opposed to asking the physicians themselves. Conscience protectors, however, would give priority to conscientious practice of individual practitioners. And so this sort of led me to the term conscientious practice, and that's simply to rely on a professional's best judgment. So we ask the physician, if the physician says they don't go in for a certain kind of treatment. They're not willing to perform X. They don't engage in practice Y. And we can talk about referrals too. I think there's good reason to defer to those professionals, as opposed to simply saying, well, here are the relevant regulations. Conscientious objection, it's a phrase that is, it's obviously the most common phrase, but I think it's more limited. So it also sets up the framing in such a way where there's already a standard and one must seek an exception to whatever the standard practice is. And I don't think it always accounts for advances in medical science. The statistic that I saw the other day, since I'm in a medical science department, there's a lot of science folks. I'm the only humanities trained person. And so scientists tell me all sorts of interesting things. I've learned a ton over the past few years. But the amount of information that a medical student, at least in our system and context, acquires today, I think it's 30% of it is useless in the next couple of years. It's just changed. So there's so much movement. And to think that with so much movement, there wouldn't be sort of more malleable understandings of standards and expectations, I think is not the best. But if you're understanding of if you understand how rapidly these kinds of things change, objection and looking for exceptions might not be the best move. And so there's also, and I thought I had a description, but I'm not putting it in there. I think we also want to distinguish between conscientious objection, maybe something broader like conscientious practice, and civil disobedience. Lots of folks have made this distinction. Dana Howard has a nice paper. She's at OSU in the US. I'm sort of talking about civil disobedience and conscientious objection. And so let me lay out a couple of cases that maybe help highlight some of these differences and get a little clearer about what I'm talking about. So we've got CO, we've got civil disobedience, and we have conscientious practice. Again, different folks have different terms. I'll use the term MAID or medical aid in dying to refer to health professionals assisting patients in the end of their life. That's a term that's used in New Jersey where I teach. Actually, it became legal in New Jersey in 2018, 2019, 2020, something like that, just as I came over to teach in this medical school. And so in thinking about the different kinds of options, the different kinds of cases, you might have a physician who makes public claims, requests an exemption from an employer, actively seeks to reverse some kind of opinion on a potential subject, whatever that subject might be, a medical practice which they don't go in for. So the physician who argues against medical aid in dying publicly, who asks to not be required to perform medical aid in dying, even in a state in the U.S. where it's legalized, and recommends that the American Medical Association or other folks sort of change guidance with respect to this, it might be involved in conscientious objection, right? They want this exemption. Now, this may be a little different, right? I mean, are they really conscientiously objecting if they're really looking to what their aim is to get MAID stricken from the record? So they actually organize and stage sit-ins, blocking with like-minded folks, blocking, barring, slowing down persons from entering a clinic where this might be offered, or blocking other physicians to coming to work to offer this. These seem like different kinds of things to me. And civil disobedience might be done in different ways, and there are gray cases. So you might also have a physician who moves to a place, the example in the US is usually some more rural area, moves to a more rural area in need of a care from a particular medical specialty, say palliative care, right? Since we're thinking about medical aid in dying, and just goes there with the intention of refusing to offer this legal instance of care. This is obstructionist. Maybe this is civil disobedience if it's quiet, but there are a variety of actions, a variety of aims in this space broadly. And I think sometimes folks arguing in the literature and arguing in person simply say it's all about conscientious objection. And I don't think that term captures everything that occurs. You might also have a physician who's practicing in, say, palliative care in a particular locale, and the laws relative to medical aid in dying change. I have in mind colleagues I had met when I first took this job who practice in particular kind of ways that when the laws change, we're not comfortable offering medical aid in dying. And so the law has changed. The physician seeks to continue the practice they had, but what if they just ask about themselves? So they just want to practice the way they had. They don't think that medical aid in dying is sort of properly health related. They don't think that the what is offered to patients in order to hasten the end of their lives actually count as medication, right? So you probably run into folks like this. They're not seeking to change the law. They're not engaged in advocacy. They're not blocking folks. And so I think there might be instances where we need to be clear about what it is that physicians are doing. And I think you can argue against, say, civil disobedience, but not argue against conscientious practice. Yeah. All right. So that's a little background about what got me interested, some terminology. And then this literature is so huge and the number of instances is wide enough. For a few minutes, I'll just sort of track some of the background that's offered in the book around patient autonomy and one strand of arguments or thread of arguments that sort of led me to some of the conclusions in the book. So in a host of conversations, I've run into folks who think, look, we should defer to physicians, we should defer to health practitioners in lots of spaces, but we should defer to patients in lots of spaces. Really what we're talking about is autonomy. And as was mentioned, so I teach bioethics, lots of bioethicists love autonomy. I'm more of a dignity guy, but we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you like. And so there's the dialectic is set up in such a way that it's practitioner autonomy, it's patient autonomy, and how can we sort of alleviate the tension that occurs? I don't really think that claims of conscientious objection, or more broadly, the kinds of considerations I'm thinking of as conscientious practice, I don't think that I don't think autonomy is the right way to think about it. Even if it were that we should respect professional autonomy and patient autonomy, I think we're talking about different kinds of things. And so another argument that I became really interested, which I think is somewhat common now in the literature, is encapsulated nicely in a paper by Lucio and Aurora, which came out in 2015. And they talk about how it's reciprocal engagement. So this is all about reciprocity. And actually I can jump to that. So Lucio and Aurora will distinguish, and lots of people do, between traditional claims of conscience or instances of conscientious objection. I'll try to use the term most people use, and contemporary accounts of conscientious objection or of conscience. And by traditional, they just mean you did the thing, right? So it's questions about performance or practice. And by contemporary, they just mean what lots of us have been thinking about and talking about in terms of being complicit in some action, or if you really trace back, complicit in evil. And so the argument is set to be about reciprocity. If a practitioner expects her autonomy to be respected, she should respect the autonomy of patients. I think rhetorically it's powerful, but I don't think the argument works. And I think what's in the background maybe are some metaphysical presumptions, but it relies on an unrealistic view of persons' lives, at least the human beings that I have interacted with, and of their own self-conceptions. I spend much of my day with medical students, and other than sort of, fighting about ethics things, they will talk about themselves and how they understand themselves to exist in the world, how lots of folks understand themselves to exist in the world, doesn't track in the way that many of the bioethicists that I know think about patient-physician interactions. So what you get, and this is a little bit snarky and crude, so I'll apologize for that, but I think what you get in some bioethics circles is simply human beings are lists of values. So we have the lists of values of the physician, that list bumps up against the values of the patient, and then the bioethicist has to do some matching work there. And I think that's just not right. People are complex, they change their views, values that they hold for particular kinds of reasons in certain contexts. And so I think it's a lot murkier and messier. I think this kind of view, though it has its upsides, I think it rules out reasonable accounts of moral responsibility and reasonable accounts of the moral life. Again, I think people are more complicated, and the upshot, spoiler alert, or if this isn't entertaining, bounce back or leave and then come back for the Q&A. The upshot of the book is that we ought to respect different conceptions of moral responsibility, and that should be understood as part of persons' moral lives. And if you're not going to do that, I think you need an argument, and we don't get that from Lucio and Aurora. And so I think that's a problem. And so their account of autonomy, I think, just fails here. Now, there's a common line of argument in response to this, a nice, again, instance of encapsulation of summary of this sort of view comes from Greenblum and Kasperbauer in a paper in 2018. And lots of folks hold views like this. Julian Savulescu, I think, is probably the most famous person in this space. Udo Schuklank has similar kinds of views. But Greenblum and Kasperbauer weigh into sort of this fight that I was having with Lucy and Aurora and say, Lucy and Aurora are right. They just haven't told us enough about what autonomy is. So Pilkington's wrong, they're right, but let's get clear on autonomy. And they say what autonomy is really about is liberty, or it's about independence. It's interesting to think about this in maybe in the US context as opposed to the UK context, as opposed to sort of global health context, where folks have different lists of values sort of culturally represented, but we can fight about that later too. And so they'll say values conflicts are always decided in favor of the patient. So sure, we notice this tension, no reason to try to do any reconciliation work. It's just always whatever the patient requests, right? Which I appreciate as a very straightforward response. I don't think it's right, but it's the decision procedure is clear. And so they say, patients, by contrast, enter their physician's office with an understanding that the physician's professional judgment, not their privately held values, and I'll say it as an aside, right, the professional versus private values sort of is a line that runs through many or much of the literature in around conscientious objection. So those privately held values will determine the advice they receive. Thus, the value imposition on physicians is not only permissible, but in some cases necessary for adequate care. So no problem if there's a tension, just do whatever the patient says. So I think though this is an advance, at least in terms of straightforwardness, on the Aluso and Aurora view, I mean, it answers the question, it guides actions in a nice and straightforward way. I think it's just wrong. And I think in the background, what's happened is we've just reverted to a values disagreement and resolved it by not allowing one party to do so. And again, I think that it's not actually an advance in thinking through the arguments. It's just, let's just opt for one side. And so there really is a deep disagreement among lots of folks around these things. And so that got me thinking, which is a chapter in the book, around disagreements. And that's what led to a lot of my interest around professions and professionalism. So if we take seriously that a disagreement exists, so if we want to do what it seems like some people in literature are suggesting, that there are two parties, Paul Cummins had a nice paper from a few years ago arguing there are three parties, it's employers, physicians, and patients. But if we want to think about how to resolve this kind of disagreement, we need to answer a few questions. And so I try to do some of this in the book. Where should the disagreement be resolved? Who are the folks who are going to be doing this work? I think one of the most common places that's offered as an instance of this is professions. And so the paper I referenced earlier by Stahl and Emanuel, New England Journal, 2017, so it says this is what happened. It's all about professions. Professions just determine the standard, and that's it. Almost. There's one qualification I'll talk about. But folks who make these kinds of arguments, when you ask them about, well, what is a profession, you get examples of professional associations. And so it's not clear if you really think, if you've done work to sort of tell us what a profession is, that's a different story. But if the adjudication of disagreements around sort of what particular procedures might be offered, what sorts of allowances professionals ought to have, what patients can reasonably request, what happens when there's tension, if this all happens among members of a single profession, just take physicians again, because I spend my day with medical students, we need a decision, we need an adjudication procedure, some work needs to be done here. What happens is that I receive a list of professional associations. So again, I live and work in the US. I think largest professional association associated with physicians is the American Medical Association. So this might be a place where this sort of disagreement could be adjudicated, at least among physicians, such that you have a united view, if you think that physicians are a single profession, a topic of a different lecture. But the American Medical Association, the last I checked, which was before I read the book, so a couple years ago, less than 24% of practicing physicians were members. And so it's not clear that professional associations, because the AMA is probably the best candidate, are the right sort of space to do this. It also doesn't address sort of differences between individual patients and individual professionals if you're thinking about the professionals who aren't looking to make social change, but really just looking to practice in the way that they have been practicing. And this isn't even to discuss whether this is a society-wide conversation or what a society is. How should you do it needs to be answered. Different folks will provide different sorts of procedures. Stallman manual, and I'll jump to this in a moment, in this paper, offer Rawlsian reflective equilibrium as the answer. Some folks think reflective equilibrium, they think Rawlsian specifically. I'm more of a let's practically reason together, but that gets really complicated when you have diverse stakeholders and maybe suggest we actually have different professions, or maybe just duel it out. In order to move forward, I think we need to answer these kinds of questions. I think we need to be straightforward about where the burden lies. Again, you can probably tell I've stacked the deck in my favor. I'm talking about conscience protectors and conscience dissenters. I think the burden lies on those who are objecting to the conscientious claims of professionals. So a little different than usual. And we have to get clear on some distinctions, whether traditional versus the contemporary distinction is actually a worthwhile distinction. What sorts of things ought professionals do if they are seeking some kind of conscience protection? And here I have in mind the sort of publicity claim. You want to hang your shingle and offer medical practice, tell everybody what you do and what you don't do. And then we'll say I'm going to jump back to the reflective equilibrium so we get that on the table because I just saw the clock. But if this is going to be enforced, right, so we're going to move forward with certain kinds of policies here. There's always concern about whether someone's deeply and sincerely held moral or core or religious beliefs, whether they really hold those. And I think trying to figure that is really complicated. And most of the ways I've seen put into practice to do this in real cases lack a kind of epistemic humility that I think is just we should move forward with. But that in a moment. Sorry about that. I've been teaching all morning or all afternoon, so my voice is a little dry. One comment before professions, and then I'll talk about some disagreement instances, and we'll do a little Rawls stuff before I jump into religion. So part of this, I think, depends on what you think of physicians as medical professionals or health professionals in general. And so if you think they're engaged in a voluntary occupation, this is not uncommon, this is the Stallman manual bit, then there's no problem, right? You go do something else. The line from that paper is, if a physician wishes to appeal to their conscience, really they should just, I think there's a quote, you can check it, go become a radiologist, which just seems not nice to radiologists. But if you think that the occupation of being a physician, it's not a vocation or calling, it's not a profession in any strong, rich, or meaningful sense, it's just a job and you can choose to do it or not do it, then you might see why sort of considerations of conscience are less persuasive to folks who hold that. So we need to get clear on professions. Other folks, and this is Savulescu, Greenblum, and Kasperbauer, think about physicians merely as employees or as public officials or semi-public officials. And so the sort of civil conversations push a lot of that work. Again, this isn't an appeal to the profession of medicine rooted in a Hippocratic tradition or something, I think, more robust like that. And some folks, though no one uses this term, seem to act as if the standard should be that patients show up, request something, and physicians just do whatever that is requested, as if they're ordering off of a menu or some kind of commodities trader. And I think, well, I'm a physician's a member for profession, maybe a few professions. But I think the others don't work. We just need to be clear about what it is, what our conception of profession is. And so I mentioned toward the beginning that one of the reasons I became interested in this had to do with a case of disagreement. And so I got a call from a physician. I don't do clinical ethics on consultation, but occasionally docs call me up. And there was a cardiologist who was rounding on a ward covering for another physician and sees a patient who is ill, is not doing well, but stable, and is 100% pacemaker dependent. And in this case, checks the patient out, patient's okay, leaves the room, and a child grabs the physician and says, "Hey, doc, turn off the pacemaker, or turn off mom's pacemaker." And the physician was taken aback, causes great internal stress, moral burden, right? And it was very challenging. The patient was suffering from dementia. And so the son, or the child in this case, was trying to speak for the patient. And what bothered the physician in this case, and what the physician thought that they should be insulated from, protected from, their conscience should be respected, is because the patient was 100% dependent on the pacemaker. The physician thought if he turned the thing off, the patient was going to die, and he would be the cause of it. And so that got me thinking a lot about moral responsibility, but it also got me thinking about professions and disagreements. And so the really interesting stuff here, I think, is in the sociology of medicine. And so I looked around to see, when you ask physicians, as far as these are representative, representative claims. In a big report from the Heart Rhythm Society in 2014, physicians thought that CIEDs, are cardiac devices. So no distinction between pacemakers, the things that pace the heart, and defibrillators, the big shocks that bring you back. They thought, look, physicians can turn off the technology at any point because you're just flipping a switch. It's just a piece of technology. That's it. It never becomes integrated in part of the body, as Somesi argues in a paper. And other folks have sort of thought about the integration of different kinds of technologies into the body. So they said, do this anytime. It's no big deal. You're not, there's nothing wrong with it. The techs, the allied professionals who actually put these things in, it gave them great pause and a great deal of stress, because they actually distinguished between different kinds of technology. And so should techs be allowed to conscientiously object? Do they have conscientious practice? Nurses similarly also distinguished and thought that there was a difference between withdrawing and withholding. The physicians did not. Anyway, so now we have philosophical distinctions, right, or ethical distinctions, which are in play in this case. And so persons are complicated, moral lives are complicated, and I think lots of times folks just think about conscientious objection in a much too narrow way. All right, I'm going to jump over this again. I saw time and I should stop. Somebody please yell, but I'll stop it in a few minutes. I think 2 more points. Still, we got religion in a moment, but let me say why reflective equilibrium won't work. So the move, if you like the professional association stuff, if you like the sort of Stoll and Emanuel line, they say, look, just run reflective equilibrium, do the Rawlsian thing. I suspect most folks have bumped into it. It's a super useful process if you haven't. So it's a process of moving back and forth between evaluations of situations and our acceptance of principles. I actually do this with medical students, right? They come up with a fairly simplistic and straightforward ethical principle. They should help people, right? And then you give them case after case, and they refine that principle until it's more complicated, but hopefully more useful and applicable. So as long as you're consistent, you're pretty good. And it's successful, I think, in resolving, or maybe successful in resolving inconsistencies in a single person's own thinking, but I don't think it works for larger groups. And for folks who think the Rawlsian version of this works, and this is what Stoll and Emanuel in this big paper do, I don't think it does. And so Rawls thought about, John Rawls, the American political philosopher, thought about parties to agreements as being fairly situated. If you really want to be just, these parties have to be fairly situated. And that's reflective of the fact that these persons are free and equal. And what Rawls said, sorry, this is throwing lots of stuff on the table, but again, big time in Q&A, we can fight a lot if you like. Rawls thought freedom was especially important, and especially important given sort of the topic of today, conscience or conscientious objection. But for Rawls, there were 3 necessary features of conceptions of freedom. Persons had to have their own conception of the good. They had to take responsibility for their own ends. And they are, depending on when you read Rawls, if it's the early version of TJ or later on, they're self-originating or self-authenticating sources of valid claims. That sounds like conscientious practice, or that sounds like the way in which you might treat a physician or a professional if you were deferring to them, right? They have their own conception of the good. They're going to take responsibility for their ends, and it's from them, right? They're self-originating sources of valid claims. And what motivates Rawls I think what motivates lots of folks to appeal to something like this is they like public-private distinctions that play well in roles, or roles as public reason versus folks who have comprehensive doctrines. And in the background, there's we don't want religion in the public square, or the line, and this isn't a quote, it's something close to this, leave your religious views at the patient's door. And so in a couple minutes, let me give the big controversial claim of the book, and then I'll wrap up with the positive claim. So that brings us to religion. Most folks that I've talked about or talked to think that conscientious objection, or conscientious practice generally, is tied to religion. More and more, I think you see claims like the description I quoted from Clark earlier that talk about moral or religious, moral and religious. I throw personal philosophical in there because I think there should be a pretty broad tent. I don't think this is about religion. There are costs to this. If you're interested in protecting the conscience of practitioners, there are costs to sort of, at least in my context, of dumping religion. But I think that's the right answer. And so some folks, the conscience dissenters, will say things like, in a professional context, personal religious convictions are secondary. The cases that are used, and these I think are somewhat common, I know them from the Stolen Manual paper, are cases, and I think this is a bit untoward actually, cases in which persons have both religious views, but they're also practicing health professionals. So lots of us, I hope, folks have run into cases where practicing Jehovah's Witnesses are not interested in receiving blood products in health interactions, right? And so the case is not that, but the case that's offered to argue against sort of physicians having religious views and any interactions in healthcare is the Jehovah's Witness surgeon. And these are all directly taken from Stolen Manual. And they say that a Jehovah's Witness surgeon would not operate with blood products. And so look, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, don't be a surgeon or something like that. They're probably a little bit more eloquent than I am and less crude, but that's the line. If you talk to Jehovah's Witnesses, that's not the case for all Jehovah's Witnesses. They may not be interested in receiving blood themselves, but would not have a problem with a patient of a different faith, different philosophical conception, just different way of being, receiving blood within surgery. A similar case is offered of, they use the term Mormon. LDS folks I know find that term offensive, so I'm just going to say LDS. LDS nurses who wouldn't want to treat an alcoholic because members of the LDS faith don't imbibe. This just seems wrong-headed to me. And most folks would be most folks I know who I've spoken with would be very happy to help alcoholics who are in need of recovery. It's just they're not going to drink themselves. A similar case is offered for a Jewish pharmacist and non-kosher gelatin that encapsulates pills. Again, it may be the case that a member of any of these faiths is not interested in that kind of practice for others, but it might be that they just think about that for themselves. And I think the kind of understanding, the kind of conception, the account of religion in this space, or at least argued by the folks who fall under the category of conscience dissenter, it doesn't track what I've understood religion to be. I think religious traditions are complex, they're multifaceted, they're contested, and diverse persons comprise them. So the religious traditions that I know the best, there are folks who identify as members of those traditions, who attend religious rituals regularly, who other folks would recognize them as members of these groups, who have different kinds of views about particular instances of medical care and what it might mean for a physician or another health professional to offer an instance. And so what I really think is going on, and again, this is the controversial claim of the book, and feedback would be great because I'll have to write something else after this thing. I think the disagreement is actually about moral responsibility. It's about how we think about our connection, or the connection of human beings between others, whether that's embedded in certain kinds of communities, whether that's just an interaction between a physician and a patient, whether it's physician interacting with patient being paid by employer, what the social context is. I think these things are messy and murky, as I mentioned before, and I think we ought to respect different accounts of moral responsibility. And so that's sort of the big upshot of the book. After laying out in a couple chapters what I think sort of goes on in the most interesting parts of the literature, I say it's not about religion. Most people say it's about religion. What's it about? Well, it's about moral responsibility. And I think we ought to respect diverse conceptions of the moral life, which include different conceptions of how persons are embedded within distinct communities and interact with others. and just the action descriptions of what are going on in these kinds of cases. And I remember hypothetically, in a case that I think illustrates this well, hypothetically at an ethics committee meeting in a large health system somewhere in the United States, when medical aid in dying was potentially on the table and it was being discussed, and I still think about this hypothetically, two excellent physicians, not good physicians, excellent physicians, who were on radically opposed sides to this view. One who thought all good physicians ought to be with their patients until the very end, and so was deeply in favor of medical aid in dying. Another who thought it was a deep violation of what physicians are as healers, violated the Hippocratic tradition and all kinds of things, along with some personal philosophical views and religious views, and that physicians should never be involved in this. When I heard these two, again, excellent physicians talk about this, you would think they were talking about different kinds of things, different action descriptions. And so I think people just have different views, and what they thought, how they thought of themselves related to the patient and the action, I think was also different. That is, we ought to, I think, allow in different accounts of moral responsibility. And this might mean that we need a lot more work on moral responsibility. I don't in the book, nor will I today, offer an account of moral responsibility. Philosophers should have more jobs. Maybe that's the upshot of the book, employ more philosophers to help think through these kinds of things. But if we're going to take this seriously and do this, I think evaluations of professionals will change. So the tribunals, and I'd be happy in the Q&A to say more about the authenticity checks, the tribunals that exist in some places, tribunals a loaded term, that the attempted checks to see if someone sincerely held belief, if they really hold it sincerely, and so we should allow for some kind of exemption, I think would go by the wayside, because I think that's both humiliating and disrespectful. It's also, I think, epistemologically problematic. But I think it is true that people ought to, if you're sort of, if you take this view seriously and you have an account of moral responsibility, you should be very straightforward about it. And so the book concludes in the final chapter in talking about the medical act, and I can say more about this again. I know I'm tight on time, sorry. But I think about the medical act very widely. So whatever it is that medical professions are doing in their capacity as physicians, again, think about physicians, we can run it with other health professionals. And so there's lots of medical acts. It's the surgeon cutting and stitching. It's the family doc prescribing different kinds of things. It's even the surgeon scrubbing in for surgery, not washing her hands while she's on vacation somewhere else, even though, given germ theory of disease, that might impact us. It's not her lobbying for better work conditions for her, her and other surgeons. It gets a little tricky if you think about health literacy, but I think the medical act is fairly wide what it is, and it omissions count as well. And so I think it connects up, penultimate point, to conscience in two ways. First, I think it's reasonable for persons to hold and act according to their own conceptions of moral responsibility. And if that's correct, then a good deal of space should be afforded individual professionals for their conscientious practice. So then give people space to do this. And secondly, how medical professionals understand what it is they do as members of the profession matters. And so I want to defer to them lots of ways, and I have long quotes I won't read from smarter people. So that's the upshot. I would love to talk more about this. Feedback would be great. And I thankfully don't have time to talk about AI. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Pilkington. A great tour d'horizon of the subject. So I would like to invite questions. Now, you can either write something in the chat or turn on your video camera if you can, and let me know, or put up an icon figure for a question on anything Bryan has been talking about or related. Just a quick question to start with concerning the religion and morality distinction. I mean, in quite a few European legislatures, I'm aware, you're sort of up against history because you've got as it were, a historical protection of certain kinds of religious conscience going way back, and that's very entrenched, and that has a depiction. I'm just wondering how you would So a lot of people would be very frightened of losing that for practical reasons, as in they think that that will offer them some kind of protection of what are in fact moral beliefs that are potentially separable from their religious beliefs. Um, so, yeah, how might you um, deal with that practical problem, as it were?
Yeah, thank you. Excellent question, and it's one that has come up in U.S. contexts as well. So folks will. It's not uncommon for folks to say something like, "Well, I appreciate that the argument will carve out some space and protection for the conscience of professionals. That sounds right, but don't get rid of the other kinds of resources for protection already in play." So I think that's it's a great question. I think it's an important practical claim. It just doesn't seem to me that the arguments bear that out. So I don't think the real cases illustrate this. It's not. It may be that, and it surely is for some folks, right? Their religious views are deeply formative about why they act in the way that they do. Even medical students of mine will say, well, I want to be a physician because, and they tell a story which engages theological narratives. But the issue around conscientious objection, I think, conscientious practice in healthcare or conscientious objection in medicine isn't that. It's really about how we're connected up with other folks. And I don't, so this might just be the failure of my imagination or my sticking too closely to this portion of the argument and, letting something that works get in the way. I just don't think it's about religion. So that's not an answer to the question. That's just saying my hope would be that
yeah.
Oh, go, please.
No, I'm sympathetic to that view. I suppose the very idea of a protected sphere, as it were, it makes quite a lot of sense that it would be something like religion and morality, as in those involve experiences and views of life which are non-negotiable, typically, or at least morality and religion both do in a way that many other spheres of life don't. So someone might say it makes a certain sense that those two things tend to be lumped together as, you might even say, expressing the dignity of the human being in a particular kind of way because they touch upon those non-negotiable cores. That's why you have the two. But of course, I agree with you that I think there is an overemphasis on religion in this area when in fact it seems to me what we should be concerned about is the morality of something much more.
Yeah, so
in a practical medical sphere, I mean.
Yes, yeah, and I think so. I'm hoping the protection becomes wider, and maybe even you garner greater agreement. So, for the person who's really interested in human dignity, right, for certain kinds of religious reasons, it is, I'm just. It doesn't matter what you do. I'm not, or what you require of. I'm not doing certain things. And for me, the content of those reasons is either formed by, influenced by, or just in fact is religious. It's a theological claim. I think someone else may say, "Well, I read the Universal Declaration, and I actually don't have any religious commitments, but I have humanistic commitments which say similar kinds of things." Maybe it's the case. So I think we just have a wider set of protections. Now that will open up another problem, which is maybe it becomes too wide, and there are folks who have something which could be personal philosophical considerations, or you just have, it's such a wide net that patients no longer have a reasonable expectation of what care might be. So I think there's that critique, but yeah, it's a good question. It's an important point. I just think we might get more folks involved, and the arguments bear it out if we have something wider.
Sure. Okay, there's someone in the chat just says iPhone, so I assume that's not a name. How does bioethics come into play in the courts? And he's asking, have you ever testified in the courts? And are bioethics experts like yourself sort of used in cases typically?
Excellent question. I am not a lawyer, and I have not testified in the courts as an expert in any way. Some bioethicists are, I think, though this is just anecdotal, this isn't sort of properly vetted. I think lots of times there are lawyers who do work in bioethics. Bioethics, at least as in the circles I am in, is a diverse field. You get lawyers, you get PhDs in philosophy, you get medical docs, you have lots and lots of folks. And I think often folks with better understanding of the law or specific topics are. I haven't, but I think they are used in these cases.
Okay, thank you. Fiona Doherty, if you could unmute.
Hi, Brian. I thought that was such an interesting talk. I really like this really, I think it's a really rich distinction you make between a religious commitment and this way of like assessing our moral commitments globally. I think I like the examples you gave of like, say, a Jewish person who doesn't mind to sell someone else non-kosher food, let's say, or medicine. Well, when you think about it, imagine that from a Catholic point of view, um, the church declared, yeah, it's fine to have for other people to have abortions, like, and it's fine for you to give them abortions if that was what they choose, but you shouldn't have one, that kind of thing, right? So then, I suppose my follow-up question, because I want to hear more about this interesting distinction before I read the book, obviously, is, what kind of things would inform that kind of assessment of moral consequence? Because it seems to me that if you just asked some very uninformed Catholics, they might even think it's okay for other people, but not me, that kind of. So it's actually the church herself, like, doesn't just give the moral precept, but also will say, and they'll teach people in different religions, will teach people, you shouldn't be complicit in that because of the way that we understand your moral integrity, the connection you have to others. So I'm wondering if religion can maybe get through the back door again, but with your distinction in place about should be a focus on how we assess our kind of general complicitness in our moral life as we move around, the complicitness of our actions and how that affects our moral integrity. Of course, it will make it richer because it will bring in people that everyone has a moral sense, but the moral sense of within major religions tends to also be informed by religious practice. The church has to be Catholic Church has to be very explicit and teach people, you are complicit in these things if you do X, Y, and Z. So yeah, I just really an invitation to say more about what different kinds of distinctions you would have in mind there.
Thank you. That's a great question. And so I think about different religious traditions are different. And so the category of religion, major religion, I think they're just different ways. I think that they're different. And so it might be the case. I don't think Catholic, so somewhat intentionally for probably the reasons that you have in mind, wasn't in any of those examples. So if you have a Catholic physician who thinks that you should never be involved in the ending of a life of a patient, or who thinks that, so it's a Catholic OB, a Catholic obstetrician, who thinks that when they see their patient, they're actually seeing two patients, right? That might be a fundamentally different kind of interaction, the Catholic physician, and another OB who thinks they're only seeing one patient. And so surely so it may even be, if you have Catholics who, it may be a one-to-one correspondence in the Catholic religion, but it may not be a one-to-one correspondence in terms of conceptions of complicity in other religions. So it may be, this is just, I'm not a scholar of religion, and it's, I no longer teach at a place where I have a chair of theology next to me and I can just sort of pop over and get help. So bear with me, but it may be that, so the Catholic claims around human dignity may do a lot more work here, such that there is less space to maneuver for physicians who are Catholic. It may also make claims, right? And it's been some time since I've read Intention, but Anscombe, Aquinas, I mean, there may be rich enough work here that like they're just really, really good arguments as to why this is what it is to be complicit with evil, and this is how close you have to be, and this is what these kinds of things matter. Whereas there may be other religious views which are still properly religious, but which have a different conception of moral responsibility. I would be interested in philosophical, though I'll open to sort of any philosophical, very broadly, arguments around moral responsibility. And I think physicians, health professionals, in this way of thinking about it, if you buy my argument, should talk about what those conceptions are if they're seeking some sort of respect for a different way than what most people go in for. And I think there's a ton of good arguments that the Catholic physician would have. So it may be that there are religious traditions which have, and this is sort of biased because it's given my interest in philosophy, but if you have a religious tradition with tons and tons of philosophical work in this space, you might just have a lot of arguments that you have to engage. So does that help, or have I just danced around the question?
No, that absolutely helps. Yeah. Because I exactly was wondering about what you've brought out, which is that some religious traditions, and certainly compared to just individuals with moral conceptions, will have more sophisticated ideas of moral responsibility. So there'll be a big scale here. So you're really talking about someone who's saying like, oh, I'm not sure if I really want to do that. It's hard to articulate the reasons, versus someone who has, is making an appeal to this like very rich concept of, say, double effect or something like that, that's been like developed for centuries and is like something that they have been forced to think about and interpret. And so like there's not everyone's actually going to have the same wealth of conception of moral responsibility as you've brought out. I think that's a really good point.
Okay, thank you. Helen Watt, if you could unmute. If you could unmute.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, no, thank you so much for your talk. Yes, my impression is actually that whether you're religious or whether you're secular, sometimes when there's something that you agree is wrong, you'll come out with a similar response when the question is about referral. So I think I'm right in saying that Savulescu says if it's something like female genital mutilation, then of course you wouldn't want to refer for that. And I think a lot of the problem is that people are thinking about the things that they think are wrong, but and they don't think that the objector's issue is a real issue. But if they think about something that they think is wrong, then all of a sudden complicity concerns will come in, which are quite familiar, to the objector. And from the objector's point of view, I think a lot of it is just about, as you say, moral responsibility. Almost by definition, if you think something is wrong, you really ought to be doing that while you think it's wrong. Maybe you're in error, maybe you need to think about it some more, but while you think it's wrong, you really shouldn't be doing it. And then the question is, how much leeway can others give you, given that you can, in some situations, you'll be making a mistake. But surely we all have to lay a lot of stress on the importance of doctors doing what they think is right. Because that may not be a sufficient condition for them to be good doctors, but surely it's a necessary condition for them to be, good doctors, at least in the wider sense. So yes, I think that maybe there's more hope for people getting together than might first appear if you just find examples of things that they think are wrong.
That's that's helpful. I think when people get pushed, right, Savosky or whoever it might be, once we start having lists of things like that, and UFTM's I think a helpful case. I think there are also instances where laws change. So I live in a place where laws are changing and sort of unanticipated, maybe sort of medical science claims at the highest level of government. And so the arguments I've offered here in nascent stages years ago, I received different responses from different folks. And so, yeah, I think you've hit on something. Sometimes people just think, well, this is wrong, and as long as it's the thing I think wrong, then we should, we should bar that. But if it's something that somebody else thinks is wrong and I think is right, it's something different. Yes, I want docs I want physicians and health professionals generally to do things that they think are right, which is part of the reason I'm, in favor of respecting conscience. But I mean, how physicians are trained, and again, it depends on the context and where you are, but how physicians are trained, there's some formation that occurs as they become more deeply involved as members of the profession, or a set of professions. Again, topic for a different lecture. And so what they might come to see as right or wrong might be influenced by other kinds of things, right? Hidden curriculum sorts of stuff. And so I think you're right, but I think reasonable people can disagree about certain kinds of things, especially if they come from different sorts of traditions. So I think that's right. I'll have to think more about how to bring that all together.
Has anyone in attendance actually had an experience of being pushed by an employer or something to do something against your conscience that they'd be happy to share, or have we all been quite lucky this way? Any further questions? I mean, it strikes me that there's any state or institution or whatever does want to get people aligned to do all sorts of things. So whenever you make a law or put in a rule, you are going to be potentially violating certain kinds of consciences. And I suppose what the institution would want to do is to make sure people get the right kinds of conscience, as it were. And it seems that is a sort of public, that is something that they need to achieve, as it were. So it seems that there's always going to be this inherent problem. And I think some people sometimes talk as though there can be no coercion, but of course it seems to be inevitable that there will be coercion of some kind in any kind of institution. I mean, do you have a particular view as what an institution, the best way in which an institution should try to form the consciences of people within it?
And
is that
that's a
something
huge
that's a very
big
question.
Good. No, that's great. This is great. No, this is good stuff. I mean, I hang out at a medical school all day, so I have all kinds of views on this. Very different than the things I thought when I taught philosophy more regularly. But I think it depends on the kind of institution it is. And so I think there's a responsibility for members of my sort of small institution, the medical school, to help form good future physicians, good in a variety of senses of the word. The medical school is connected to a large health system. Is the health system's responsibility? I think I'm not sure, but I think as what did someone call me the other day? As a medical educator, that there are certain kinds of requirements, but it raises questions. I have colleagues who are practicing physicians. I think they have different obligations to future physicians than I do. I'm just a philosopher. I'm not a member of a profession. I try to help students figure these things out by pointing out particular kinds of inconsistencies. I'll talk about rich moral lives and all that sort of stuff too with them. But yeah, so it's a great question. We have robust resources in professionalism and health professionalism. Students do a lot of work in our spaces in professional identity formation. It's only when things go awry that I get a, hey, Bryan, can you teach a course on honesty, say, as part of a remediation for something like that, which ends up being fun because you can make them, read Bernard Williams and stuff, which they're not going to read otherwise. But I think it's a great question. I think it depends on what institution they are that we're thinking about. Medical schools, yes, you got to make sure or try to put students in the best situation to succeed and be good professionals. But it might depend on the particular person and their role in that.
Okay. Okay, question from Stephen Napier. What's the difference between conscientious objection and intellectual or ideological objection? There seems to be a subtle distinction.
Good. What do you mean by ideological or intellectual or ideological objection?
I think this was Stephen's question. I'm Stephen Napier.
Yep.
I think this was Stephen's question.
Yeah. Sure. If Stephen wants to respond, if you just unmute yourself. Could you unmute?
Yeah, okay. No, it seems like a lot of the objections sounds like they can be theoretical. But what's the difference between a theoretical objection and a conscientious objection? Is the conscientious objection based on your conscience? How do we know what is conscience and what is a theoretical objection? Or intellectual objection?
Yeah, good. So
what I'm asking is, where is conscience in this? And what's the boundary, or where do you go from conscience step over then into some sort of intellectual argument for your position?
Yeah, good. So, and I probably need sort of a robust account of conscience. I've run with Solmesi's line, and I have this on a slide somewhere. And I can share slides, everybody. But where conscience has those two parts, right? It's the commitment to morality itself, to acting and choosing morally according to one's best ability, and the activity of judging that an act has been done or about which one is deliberating would violate a commitment. So is the concern that I might just be objecting to something, but I don't really have a deeply held belief connected to what I think is right and wrong, but rather it's just, well, I don't want to do X, and I have some other kind of reason. What sort of motivates the concern about conscience versus just intellectual or ideological?
Yeah, I'm wondering, where's the distinction? That's my question. Because obviously, if you've got a conscientious objection, you've got to have a theoretical argument to back it up.
Well, I wonder, do you? Can I just chip in?
Yeah. So what is conscience?
I mean,
Helen,
you could
if you wanted
argue,
to say.
yeah. I mean, you could argue that you don't need a big theory about it. Sometimes you'll just think, I can't do that. And in fact, there was quite an interesting article by someone who, on conscience, by someone who himself does quite late-term abortions, actually. But he was arguing in favour of more conscience allowance, for people, because all of a sudden a student comes across something, in his area and doesn't want to do it, and doesn't have a developed theory about it. She just doesn't want to do it. And I think when we talk about respecting conscience, we shouldn't require the healthcare professional to have a developed theory, because sometimes it's enough, I think this would be wrong to do. Now, okay, you might think about it later and develop a theory, but, I think this is wrong to do is already pretty serious. You're asking her to do something she thinks is wrong to do.
Yeah, so I think that that's I would want to ask why. So maybe I want a little more, but I am short of. I mean, I as I mentioned before, I find I don't think someone needs a fully developed theory. I also I'm hesitant to push the why too far because at least in the contexts that I'm aware of, where folks attempted to conscientiously object to something, they had to give a detailed account and prove why this was a sincerely held belief, which I think is epistemologically problematic and also just not a nice thing to do. And so I take it comes from larger employers, at least in the context where I am, where they, you need X number of nurses performing Y amount of care in Z hospital. What do? So you put up some sort of obstacle. But yeah, I think and maybe I push the argument in this way and saying that, like, hey, maybe there'll be more jobs for philosophers and we should think really seriously about conceptions of moral responsibility. What about the person who just says no? It makes me feel, yeah, it feels wrong to me.
I mean, might someone say that that's sort of rather in the nature of conscience, that your conscience expresses itself often in a kind of feeling or whatever before you can necessarily get up. And of course, some people are not very good at doing that at all anyway. That this is not the way they think. Or I mean, I can see that you obviously want to distinguish frivolous objections and feelings, but the more you do that, the more you're going to get into a discussion about reasons. And I think what Helen's suggesting is experience of conscience actually one that's not immediately expressible by everybody in terms of reasons. I mean, they might think that it's a cognitive faculty or something like that, but it expresses itself through I feel awful, and there's maybe a particular kind of harm, a moral harm that disobeying that does, even if I can't give a big theory about it. That it will involve me in a particular kind of harm, which really seems very different from other kinds of harms. Maybe that's I don't know. Sorry, I'm just
yeah. No, I mean that's good. And then sort of long conversations about complicity. Maybe they don't even. Yeah, I mean, so the people that I know that adjudicated these sorts of things would have then requested detailed information about your reasons, and it wouldn't have to be. I don't think that the reasons have. I don't think there has to be a big theory, right? You don't have to go into for this account of moral responsibility or that account of moral responsibility, but you'd have to say something like, "Well, on Sundays I go to this church, and these are the reasons why." Or on Friday evenings I attend this synagogue, and these are the reasons why. And so, like, there was which again I think is problematic because you also have, and maybe this is too easy to say, but life is complicated. Religious traditions are complicated and complex. And the person evaluating these things is not, at least in the context that I have been, not a member of, the same tradition, standing, practice. And so conversations, I think, within particular kinds of traditions, and I'm sort of a McIntyrean, my cards on the table about traditions, they're different than if you're within another concept. They're just resources that you don't have. I mean, maybe, some of us want to talk about Anscombe and Aquinas. If you haven't read any Aquinas, that's great. You read something else, but there just may be different sets of resources. And so, yeah, maybe I may have to rethink a little bit the role for philosophers and what kinds of conceptions of moral responsibility might be required. I think different people have different conceptions, and we should allow those in. But my point that, well, then we're going to adjudicate those. Yeah, maybe that repeats a problem that I've found in other people's views. So thank you. This is really, really helpful.
Good. And my apologies for confusing the two Stevens. We have two Stevens here, so sorry about that. Okay. Well, is there any final questions? Okay, well, just before I wrap up, a little bit of in the chat is if anyone would like to make a donation, that would be a very moral thing to do to the BIOS Centre, then please do. Just we survive on donations, and happy and grateful to be able to invite people like Professor Pilkington and others, especially in these days with much confusion about medical ethics. So I'd just like to thank you all very much for coming, and especially Professor Pilkington. Thank you very much for your talk. I hope we will go out and buy his book and keep thinking about conscience. So thank you very much indeed, Professor. And
thank you all for the invitation and the conversation. It was helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.